My hands are shaking as I tell you this story, and at 86 years old, you'd think I'd have gotten over the fear by now, but some memories stay with you forever. I need you to understand something before I begin. I was going to kill my grandmother. That's right, you heard me correctly. Little 12-year-old Evelyn Thompson from Redding, California, was planning to murder the woman who was supposed to love and protect her. Every night for 4 years, from the time I was 12 until I turned 16, I would lie in that cramped attic room, my body aching from whatever punishment Agnes had decided I deserved that day, and I would whisper to myself the same words over and over again. She's going to pay for this. I'm going to make her pay. You might think that sounds terrible, hearing an old woman admit she once planned to take a life, but you have to understand what that woman did to me after my parents died. Agnes Thompson wasn't just cruel. She was methodical in her cruelty. She would wait until the sun went down when the neighbors couldn't hear my screams, and then she would come for me. Sometimes it was her fists, sometimes it was a belt, sometimes she would lock me in that attic for days without food, and always she would tell me that it was my fault my parents were dead, that I was cursed, that I brought nothing but misery to everyone around me. I believed her. For 4 long years, I believed every poisonous word that came out of her mouth, and that belief turned me into someone I barely recognize when I look back now. I became calculating, patient, dangerous in ways that no child should ever have to be. I studied her routines, I memorized her weaknesses, I even stole a kitchen knife and hid it under my mattress, planning the perfect moment when I would finally get my revenge. But here's what I never expected, what changed everything and probably saved both our souls. Sometimes the person who saves you comes from the most unexpected place, and sometimes healing begins when you least expect it to. You have to understand, when my parents Clara and James died in that car wreck on Highway 299, I was completely alone in this world except for Agnes. She was my father's mother, and I'd only met her a handful of times before that awful day when the sheriff came to our door. I remember thinking, as they drove me to her house with my few belongings in a paper bag, that maybe this was God's way of giving me a new start, a grandmother who would bake cookies and tell me stories and hold me when I cried for my mama and daddy. What a foolish little girl I was. Agnes took one look at me standing on her porch, and I could see the hatred in her eyes immediately. She told me right then and there that I looked exactly like my mother, and she said my mother's name like it was something dirty, something that left a bad taste in her mouth. That first night, when she dragged me up to that attic and told me that's where unwanted children belonged, I knew my life had taken a turn towards something terrible. But I was just a child, and children adapt, even to the worst circumstances. I learned to walk quietly so the floorboards wouldn't creak. I learned to make myself small and invisible during the day. And most importantly, I learned to plan. Every beating, every cruel word, every night I spent hungry and cold in that attic, I was adding to my list of reasons why Agnes Thompson needed to disappear from this earth. I filled notebook after notebook with my plans, drawing maps of the house, timing her daily routines, figuring out exactly how I was going to make her suffer the way she made me suffer. For 4 years, revenge was the only thing that kept me going, the only thing that made me feel like I had any power at all. But there was this man, this neighbor who lived 3 houses down, and I never could have imagined that Harold Brooks would be the one to show me that there was another way to fight back, a way that wouldn't destroy what was left of my soul. If you can, please leave in the comments where you're watching this old lady from. It warms my heart to know that my voice is reaching far, maybe even places I never had the chance to visit. And if you like my story, please leave a like and subscribe to Grandparents Archives. It helps us to keep sharing meaningful stories like this. Let me tell you about the life I had before everything went wrong, because you need to understand what I lost to really understand what came after. My parents, Clara and James Thompson, weren't wealthy people. Daddy worked at the lumber mill and Mama took in sewing to make ends meet, but our little house on Shasta Street was filled with so much love that I thought every family lived the way we did. Mama would wake me up every morning by singing some silly song she'd make up on the spot, usually about what we were having for breakfast, or how pretty my hair looked when it was all tangled from sleep. Daddy would come home every evening with sawdust in his hair and splinters in his hands, but he'd always have time to help me with my arithmetic or listen to me read from whatever book I'd borrowed from the library that week. We'd sit on the front porch after dinner, the three of us squeezed together on that old wooden swing, and they'd tell me stories about when they were young, about how they met at a church social when Mama spilled punch all over Daddy's best shirt. I was their whole world, and they were mine. I never doubted for even a second that I was wanted, that I was loved, that I belonged somewhere. The accident happened on a Tuesday in March of 1951. I remember because it was the day before my friend Betty's birthday party, and I was supposed to help Mama bake the cake that evening. They were driving home from town where they'd gone to pick up some fabric for a dress Mama was making for me, something special for Easter Sunday. A logging truck ran a stop sign at the intersection of Highway 299 and Pine Street. The sheriff said they died instantly, that they wouldn't have felt any pain, but I've never been able to stop wondering if they thought about me in those last few seconds, if they were scared, if they knew they were leaving me all alone. I stayed with our neighbor Mrs. Patterson for 3 days while they tried to figure out what to do with me. I kept thinking Mama and Daddy would walk through the door any minute, that this was all some terrible mistake, that someone would realize they'd made an error and bring my parents back to me. But then Agnes arrived. I'd met my grandmother maybe 5 times in my whole life. She lived clear on the other side of town and rarely visited because, as I learned later, she and my mother couldn't stand each other. Agnes blamed my mother for taking her son away from her, for filling his head with ideas about love and happiness when she believed life was meant to be hard and joyless. Agnes was 63 years old then, a tall, thin woman with steel-gray hair pulled back, so tight it seemed to stretch the skin on her face. She wore the same black dress to everything, church, the grocery store, my parents' funeral, and she had this way of looking at people like they'd already disappointed her before they even opened their mouths. When she came to collect me from Mrs. Patterson's house, she stood in the doorway with her lips pressed into a thin line and said, "Well, I suppose you're my responsibility now. Not 'I'm sorry for your loss,' or 'everything will be all right,' or even 'come give your grandmother a hug.' Just that cold statement of fact that I was now her burden to bear. The ride to her house took 20 minutes, and she didn't say a single word to me the entire time. I sat in the passenger seat of her old Ford, clutching the paper bag that held everything I owned. A few dresses, some books, a photograph of my parents, and the little wooden horse Daddy had carved for me when I was 8. I kept looking out the window, hoping we'd drive past our old house, so I could see it one more time, but Agnes took a different route, one that led through the industrial part of town where the air smelled like sawdust and diesel fuel. Agnes's house was on Elm Street, a narrow 2-story building that looked like it had been painted gray about 20 years ago and never touched since. The yard was mostly dirt with a few struggling rose bushes that seemed to be dying from neglect. Inside, everything was dark and cramped and smelled like old cooking grease and mothballs. The furniture was covered in doilies and antimacassars, and there were religious pictures on every wall. Jesus on the cross, the Virgin Mary looking sorrowful, various saints I couldn't identify staring down at me with judgmental eyes. She showed me to the attic room that first day, climbing those steep wooden stairs with me following behind like a condemned prisoner. The room was small and hot, with one tiny window that looked out onto the neighbor's garbage cans. There was a narrow bed with a thin mattress, a rickety dresser with one drawer that stuck, and nothing else. No rug on the floor, no pictures on the walls, no lamp except for one bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. "This is where you'll sleep," Agnes said, setting my paper bag on the bed. "You'll keep this room clean, you'll make your bed every morning, and you'll stay up here unless I tell you otherwise. I run a quiet house, and I expect children to be seen and heard as little as possible." That first week, I tried so hard to be good, to be the kind of granddaughter she might learn to love. I made my bed with military precision every morning. I stayed in my room reading or looking out that little window at the world below. I came downstairs only when she called me for meals, and I ate whatever she put in front of me without complaint, even though it was usually just bread and thin soup or leftover beans from the night before. But nothing I did was ever good enough. If I walked too heavily on the stairs, she'd yell at me for making noise like a stampeding elephant. If I was too quiet, she'd accuse me of sneaking around and plotting mischief. If I smiled, she'd tell me to wipe that stupid grin off my face because I had nothing to be happy about. If I looked sad, she'd say I was wallowing in self-pity and needed to accept my circumstances. The first time she hit me was about 2 weeks after I'd moved in. I'd accidentally knocked over a glass of water at dinner, and before I could even apologize, her hand came across my face, so hard it knocked me clean off my chair. I sat there on the kitchen floor, my cheek burning and my ears ringing, and she stood over me with her eyes blazing with an anger that seemed way too big for such a small mistake. "Clumsy, just like your mother," she hissed. Clara could never do anything right either, and look how she ended up. Dead in a ditch because she was too stupid to pay attention to where she was going. That night, lying in my narrow bed with my face still throbbing, I realized that Agnes wasn't going to get better, that this wasn't just an adjustment period where we'd eventually learn to care about each other. She hated me, purely and completely, and she was going to make sure I knew it every single day I lived under her roof. The beatings became regular after that. Some nights she'd drag me out of bed for no reason I could understand, screaming about how I was eating her out of house and home, how I was an ungrateful burden she never asked for, how I had the devil in me just like my mother did. She'd hit me with her fists, with a wooden spoon, with whatever was handy, until I collapsed on the floor and everything went black. Then I'd wake up hours later, still on the kitchen floor or sometimes back in my bed, my body a map of bruises and aches. During the day, when the neighbors might see or hear something, Agnes would put on this performance of being a dutiful grandmother doing her Christian duty. She'd speak to me in this fake sweet voice when Mrs. Henderson from next door was around, asking if I'd had enough to eat or if I needed anything for school. But the moment we were alone, the mask would slip, and I'd see that cold hatred in her eyes again. I learned to read the signs that meant a beating was coming. If she'd had a bad day at her job cleaning offices downtown, if a bill came in the mail that was higher than expected, if she'd gotten into an argument with someone at church, any little thing could set her off, and I'd pay the price for it that night. I started keeping track in a little notebook I'd hidden under my mattress, marking down every cruel word, every blow. Every night I went to bed hungry because she decided I didn't deserve dinner. Looking back now, I think Agnes was probably suffering from her own demons. The death of her husband a few years before I arrived, the strained relationship with my father, the disappointment of a life that hadn't turned out the way she'd hoped. But I was just a 12-year-old girl who'd lost everything, and I didn't have the wisdom or compassion to understand that hurt people often hurt other people. All I knew was that every day I stayed in that house, I was dying a little more inside, and something had to be done about it. By the time I'd been living with Agnes for 6 months, the beatings had become as regular as dinner. Every night around 9 o'clock, after her radio programs ended, she'd stand up from her chair, and I'd know it was time. She'd drag me up to that attic, take down Daddy's old leather belt that she kept hanging on a nail, and start swinging. "You look just like her," she'd say while the leather cracked against my back. "Same stubborn face as your mother." Clara thought she was too good for this family, and look where it got her. Dead in a ditch. She'd make me apologize for things that weren't my fault, for being born, for my parents dying, for being a burden to her. And if I didn't sound sorry enough, she'd start all over again. Some nights she'd skip the belt entirely and just lock me in that room for hours, sometimes until the next evening, with no food or water. She'd turn off the electricity so I'd sit in complete darkness, listening to mice in the walls while she stood outside the door telling me horrible stories about my mother, about how the car accident was probably my parents' own fault for being careless and selfish. That's when I started writing in a journal I'd stolen from school. I'd hide it under a loose floorboard and write down everything. What time she came for me, what she said, how many times she hit me. But gradually my entries changed. I started writing about what I wanted to do to her. "Tonight I'm going to put something in her food," I wrote after she'd left me locked up for 18 hours. Maybe just enough to make her sick. I found where she keeps her bedroom key. I wrote another time. I could sneak in while she's sleeping. The fantasies got darker. I'd lie in bed covered in fresh bruises, imagining Agnes begging me for mercy the way I'd begged her. Writing those revenge plans was the only thing that made me feel like I still existed as a person. But it was changing me too. I stopped crying during beatings because I didn't want to give her the satisfaction. I stopped flinching when she raised her hand. I started looking at her with the same cold hatred she showed me. By the time I turned 14, I wasn't really a child anymore. I'd learned to disconnect from my body during the worst moments, to smile and lie when teachers asked if everything was all right at home, to wear long sleeves in summer to cover the marks. Most importantly, I'd learned to hate with a purity that scared me sometimes. I stopped feeling like a human being and started feeling like a weapon being forged in fire. I was surviving, but I was also planning. And Agnes had no idea that the frightened little girl she thought she was breaking was turning into someone who might eventually break her right back. When I turned 14, I stopped just writing angry words and started actually planning. I'd watch Agnes during dinner, noting how her hands shook when she was tired, how she always checked the door locks twice, how she kept her purse in the same spot every day. Late at night, after she'd finished beating me, I'd sneak downstairs and stand in that kitchen, staring at the knives in the drawer. I'd picture her face when she realized I wasn't helpless anymore. Sometimes I'd take one of the smaller knives back to my room, just to hold it, just to imagine what it would feel like to have the power for once. The guilt would hit me afterward. She was still my grandmother, still family. My mother would have been horrified knowing I had these thoughts. But then Agnes would catch me looking at her and say something like, "What are you staring at, you little pest?" And the guilt would burn away. I started with small things. Agnes kept a coffee can of loose change on the refrigerator, quarters and dimes she saved for fabric. I began taking a few coins here and there, hiding them in my room. Then I graduated to hiding her things. Her reading glasses would disappear from the kitchen table and turn up in the basement days later. Her church hat would vanish and reappear in the attic. I'd watch her search frantically, muttering about getting forgetful, and feel this spark of satisfaction. But it wasn't enough. Taking quarters and hiding scissors. What kind of revenge was that? She was destroying everything I was, and I was fighting back by moving her eyeglasses. I noticed Agnes took sleeping powder every night, some mixture she said helped her nerves. I started researching at the library what might happen if someone took too much. I told myself I wasn't planning to kill her, just make her sick enough for the hospital, maybe give me time to escape. I also found the spare key she kept under a loose brick by the front steps. I made copies at the hardware store, telling the clerk my grandmother was always losing her keys. Maybe I could sneak out at night, find somewhere else to go. The hardest part was how alone I felt. Agnes had convinced everyone she was this saintly woman taking in her orphaned granddaughter. Teachers thought she was wonderful. Neighbors praised her sacrifice. Even the preacher mentioned what a blessing it was that little Evelyn had such a devoted grandmother. So I kept everything to myself, writing detailed plans in my journal. I drew maps of the house, noting which floorboards creaked. I made lists of Agnes's routines, her weaknesses. I researched ways to hurt someone without leaving evidence. Part of me knew this wasn't normal, that 14-year-old girls shouldn't plot against their guardians. But the pain was constant, the anger growing every day. For more years until I turned 18 felt like forever. Something had to change, and if nobody would help me, I'd help myself. The only thing stopping me was fear of getting caught, of ending up somewhere worse. But that fear was shrinking, overwhelmed by rage building like pressure in a kettle. I just needed the right moment, the right plan that would finally give me the revenge I'd been dreaming about. Harold Brooks lived 3 houses down in a yellow house with actual flowers and a porch swing that looked used. I'd noticed him before, maybe 50, always wore suspenders, whistled while gardening. Agnes said he was a retired schoolteacher who never married, like that was somehow wrong. We first really talked on a Tuesday in October. I was sitting on Agnes's front steps crying because she'd found money I'd stolen and beaten me worse than usual. My ribs hurt so bad I could barely breathe. Mr. Brooks was coming back from his mailbox when he saw me. Instead of ignoring me or asking questions I couldn't answer, he sat down next to me and pulled a red apple from his jacket. "Here," he said. "Sometimes when the world feels too heavy, an apple helps a little." I took it because I was hungry. Agnes had decided I didn't deserve breakfast. We sat in silence while I ate. When I finished, he looked at me with kind brown eyes and said, "You're stronger than you know, Evelyn. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." After that, Mr. Brooks started appearing when I needed him most. He'd help me carry heavy grocery bags, ask about books I was reading, bring over volumes from his personal library. He noticed I struggled with bigger words and started what he called informal lessons on Agnes's front steps. Agnes didn't mind because he was always respectful, always complimented her fine job raising me. She had no idea that during these reading sessions he told me stories about his own childhood, growing up with a father who drank too much and a mother working 3 jobs. "I used to think the only way to deal with angry people was to get angry right back," he said one afternoon. "Took me years to learn that anger just makes more anger." He'd tell me about former students from difficult homes who grew up to become teachers and doctors, people who helped instead of hurt. "The strongest people I've ever known are the ones who chose to be kind even after the world was cruel to them." By 15, I'd been meeting with Mr. Brooks for almost a year, but I was deeper into revenge planning than ever. I'd figured out exactly how much sleeping powder would make Agnes seriously ill, even stolen a bottle from the pharmacy. The weight of this secret was destroying me. I trusted Mr. Brooks more than anyone, but I was terrified he'd try to stop me or tell someone who'd just send me somewhere else terrible. But one evening in March, after Agnes locked me in the attic for 2 days because I'd given her a disrespectful look, I was on the front steps again. Mr. Brooks came over with his usual apple, and the words just poured out. "I'm going to hurt her," I said. "I'm going to make her feel what she makes me feel every night." I expected shock, lectures about forgiveness. Instead, he was quiet, then said, "Tell me what you're thinking about doing." So I did. I told him about the sleeping powder, the knives, all the ways I'd imagined making Agnes pay. About the bruises and beatings and nights locked in darkness. When I finished, Mr. Brooks looked at me with understanding instead of pity. "You know what I see when I look at you? Someone who's been hurt so badly she thinks the only way to stop pain is to pass it on. But revenge doesn't heal anything. It just creates more broken people." He pulled out a small leather notebook, worn from years of handling. I kept a journal too when I was 15. Wrote down every cruel thing my father did, every way I wanted to make him suffer. You know what happened when I finally got big enough to fight back? I became just like him. I stared at that notebook, realizing this gentle man had once been as full of rage as me. "But she deserves it," I whispered. "Maybe she does," Mr. Brooks said. "But you don't deserve to become someone who hurts people. You can be bigger than her hate, Evelyn. You can choose to be the person your parents would have wanted you to be." For the first time in 3 years, I cried real tears instead of angry ones. Because somebody finally saw me as a person who had choices, who could decide what kind of human being she wanted to become. The night I turned 16, I made my decision. Agnes had been particularly vicious that evening. She'd found my journal hidden under the floorboard and read every word I'd written about her. She beat me with that leather belt until I couldn't stand, screaming that I was an ungrateful snake who'd been plotting against her all along. But instead of breaking me, something inside me finally snapped into place. After she locked me in the attic, I waited until I heard her bedroom door close. Then I crept downstairs to the kitchen and took the biggest knife from the drawer, the one she used for cutting meat on Sundays. I stood outside her bedroom door for what felt like hours, holding that knife and thinking about all the ways I could make her suffer. My hand was shaking, but not from fear, from pure rage that had been building for 4 years. When I finally pushed open her door, Agnes was sitting up in bed like she'd been waiting for me. The moonlight from her window made her look ancient and fragile, and for the first time I realized she wasn't this powerful monster I'd created in my mind. She was just a bitter old woman who'd taken her own pain and passed it on to me. "Go ahead," she said quietly, looking at the knife in my hand. "Finish what you started." I raised that knife, ready to scare her the way she'd scared me every night for 4 years. But when I looked into her eyes, I didn't see the hatred I expected. I saw emptiness. She was already dead inside, had been for years probably, and hurting her wasn't going to bring me back to life. I dropped the knife on her bedroom floor and walked away. She didn't chase me, didn't scream, didn't say another word. She just sat there in her bed, silent, like she knew she'd finally lost whatever hold she'd had over me. I packed my few belongings in that same paper bag I'd arrived with and left that house before dawn. I walked straight to Mr. Brooks's yellow house and knocked on his door, even though it was barely 5 in the morning. I didn't do it. I told him when he opened the door in his bathrobe. But I can't stay there anymore. Mr. Brooks didn't ask questions. He just made me breakfast and helped me figure out what came next. Turns out he'd been planning for this moment, had already spoken to people at the Methodist church about families who might take in a girl who needed a place to finish high school. The Hendersons were an older couple whose own children had grown up and moved away. They had a spare room and a belief that everyone deserved a second chance. They took me in that very day, no questions asked, no payment expected. Just kindness from people who had enough of it to share. Living with the Hendersons was like learning to breathe again. Mrs. Henderson would ask if I'd slept well in the mornings, and she actually wanted to hear the answer. Mr. Henderson helped me with my math homework at the kitchen table while she cooked dinner. They treated me like I was their own daughter, like I was someone worth caring about. I finished high school, got good enough grades to earn a small scholarship to the Teachers College in Sacramento. Mr. Brooks had been right about anger creating more anger. Once I stopped feeding mine, once I stopped planning revenge and started planning a future, everything changed. I became a second-grade teacher, just like Mr. Brooks had been. I met my husband Robert at a church social when I was 22. He was kind and patient and never once raised his voice to me, even when we disagreed about things. We had 3 children together, and I made sure they grew up in a house full of laughter and safety, everything I'd wanted when I was small. As for Agnes, I heard through the church gossip network that she died alone in that house on Elm Street when I was 25. No one found her for 3 days. The neighbors said she'd become even more bitter and isolated after I left, that she drove away anyone who tried to help her. That was her punishment, not anything I did to her, but the emptiness she'd created for herself by choosing hatred over love. I never went to her funeral. I was busy teaching my students and raising my babies and building a life that was bigger than the pain she'd tried to make me carry forever. Revenge wouldn't have fixed me. Only I could do that, and I did it by choosing to become someone who protected children instead of hurting them, who created safe spaces instead of destroying them, who passed on kindness instead of cruelty. That was my real victory over Agnes Thompson, not making her suffer, but refusing to become her. I'm sitting here now at 86 years old, in this same living room where I've watched my grandchildren take their first steps and heard their laughter fill spaces that were once silent with fear. Harold Brooks taught me something that saved my life, that I could choose forgiveness not for Agnes's sake, but for my own. Not because she deserved it, but because I deserved to be free. People ask me sometimes how I got past all that anger, all that hatred I carried for so many years. The truth is, I didn't just get past it, I used it. Every time one of my students came to school with bruises they couldn't explain, every time I saw a child who was too quiet or too afraid, I remembered what it felt like to be powerless, and I made sure they knew they weren't alone. I became the adult I needed when I was 12 years old. That's what real strength looks like. It's not hurting the people who hurt you. Any angry person can do that. Real strength is taking your pain and turning it into something that helps heal other people's pain. It's choosing to plant flowers in ground that was once burned, to build something beautiful where something ugly used to be. I kept that old journal of mine, the one where I wrote all those revenge fantasies. Sometimes I read it to remind myself how far I've come, how different my life became when I stopped planning to destroy someone else and started planning to build myself up instead. The scared, angry girl who wrote those words grew into someone who spent 40 years teaching children to read, who raised 3 good kids, who has 7 grandchildren who will never know what it feels like to be afraid in their own home. That's my message to anyone who's listening to this story right now. You get to choose who you become. The people who hurt you don't get to write the ending of your story. You do. And if an angry, broken 15-year-old girl from Redding, California could find her way to forgiveness and healing, then so can you. If this story moved you in any way, I hope you'll subscribe to Grandparents' Archives for more real stories from people like me who've lived through difficult times and found their way to the other side. Hit that like button if you believe in the power of choosing healing over revenge, and share this with someone who might need to hear that they're stronger than their circumstances. Leave me a comment below. Have you ever had to choose forgiveness for your own sake? I'd love to hear from you. Thank you for listening to my story, and for letting an old woman remind you that it's never too late to choose love over hate, hope over despair, healing over revenge. That's the real victory, not getting even but getting free.